right, welcome to our 2021 annual Dr. Martin Luther King Commemoration. This year is going to look a little different, as you can imagine, because we are virtual. The title of our discussion today is Honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Power of Protest, Marches, and College Students. My name is Shanae Owens. I serve as the Associate Director of the Center for Student Diversity, and I will serve as one of your moderators for this evening. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Student Diversity, on behalf of myself, Dr. Kimberly Weatherly, who is the Director, Roxana Aguirre, who is the Assistant Director, and welcome to our discussion. We will introduce our panelists as we move along, but at first, I would like to introduce you to my co-moderator, Alton Costin III, class of 23. So Alton sent me a formal bio, but I know Alton for real, so I'm gonna read you what he sent me.
No, don't.
That's what I'm supposed to do. Alton is a sophomore at the college, double majoring in public policy and Africana studies. In addition to previously interning at the ACLU of Virginia, as well as being recommended by Delegate Patrick Hope of Arlington to advise the Virginia Board of Corrections on its application of isolated confinement in local correctional facilities. He is also a Jackie Robinson Foundation Scholar, William and Mary Scholar, and a winner of the Huline Willis Association Memorial Scholarship. On campus, Alton does everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. There is a list, but I would just like to say Alton is my go-to person. So when I said, hey, I need some students to help me plan this event, he raised his hand. He spent some time during his winter break, and we made sure that we had a worthwhile MLK celebration for tonight. So I'm going to turn things over to you.
Man, Shanae, she did a little too much for me. She boosted me a little bit too much on that one, but I appreciate that, But yeah, man, Shanae, anytime she needs anything, she knows I'm there for her. But yeah, man, I'm just happy to be here tonight, happy to moderate with you guys. We're going to have a little bit of fun, man. We're going to have a little bit of fun. Have a lot of great topics of discussion that are very prevalent to today's sort of society, and what's going on in it. But yeah, man, let's get into it. So why are we here?
I'm sorry, Alton, one moment. I just want to mention that there is a Q&A feature. So at the end of the formal discussion, there will be an opportunity for you to ask some questions. So if you have a burning question while we are talking, feel free to add it to the Q&A portion feature in the Zoom, and we'll get to it afterwards.
That's what co-moderators are for, man. When you slip up, mess up, yeah, they come through and save you. But yeah, man, we're today to honor Dr. King. And Shanae gave me the opportunity to literally just pretty much go over what he meant to me while we're here. And, oftentimes we stand on the shoulders of giants, and giants who are willing to give up everything, including their lives for the advancement of their people. And Dr. King is one of those giants, as you all may know. And despite any sort of personal inclinations that we may have over his political or social ideology or political demeanor, one thing and one reason why his legacy is forever in doubt is because he simply was a man of his word. He was a man who believed in civil disobedience, which is sort of the understanding that without tension, there can be no progress. And although the I Have a Dream speech, that's everybody's favorite thing by him, but for me, the most influential and sort of, I guess I would say, promising thing for me would be his I Have Been to the Mountaintop and his letter from Birmingham jail. Because I believe that those two pieces sort of, they they encapsulated exactly what he stood for. And I say that because oftentimes the legacy of Dr. King is misstated, misinterpreted, or skewed purposely by many people. Um, for example, in his letter of Birmingham jail, he talked about the nonviolent thing I was telling you about. He said that nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. He seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. Now, it's equally important that although everybody loved Dr. King now, back when he was really popping in 1968, he was one of, if not the most hated men in America, according to a Harris poll. And he was hated because that tension that we previously discussed, he let it be known publicly. And that's where, in the letter of Birmingham jail, as well as I've been to the mountaintop, he pretty much started calling people out, including some of his own kin, including some of the church members, as well as politicians who were vindicative in their actions. So I guess what I would say that Dr. King, for me, he's one that stood to his word, despite the media going against him and turning his back on him, despite being abandoned by supporters who believed that his strategy was inefficient, despite just people not believing him whatsoever. And in today's case, um, he pretty much he pretty much emphasizes the fact that we have to stay true to our cause in this movement, um, not for a singular protest, for a singular petition, for a singular legislative action, but for the entire duration of this movement. So that's what Dr. King means to me, and I'm excited, man. And I'm gonna pass it over to you, Shanae, because I know you got something popping too. I know you got some heat going.
Thank you for sharing that. So, in planning this event, one thing we wanted to do, of course, as we are honoring Dr. King, we wanted to make sure that we're making it relevant to our times that we're living in today. And unfortunately, a lot of the things that were going on during the civil rights movement, we're seeing now, which I hate to say out loud, but it is what it is. So, in planning this event, I began to reflect back on SNCC as well as the Freedom Riders, and specifically the power of college students in different movements. If you think back to all the pictures that you see with Dr. King, these were young men and women that were standing alongside him in this movement. And as you turned on the news throughout 2020, these were young people standing up and saying, Black Lives Matter. We matter. These issues matter to us. Listen to us. We need to be heard. So I want to take the time to give an overview of these two specific SNCC as well as Freedom Riders to give you some context of the past as we are moving forward into our discussion of what our present day movements look like. So SNCC, or Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was a civil rights group formed to give younger Black people more of a voice in the civil rights movement. In the wake of the Greensboro sit-in at the lunch counter closed to Black people, Ella Baker, then director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, helped to set up the first meeting of what became the SNCC. She was concerned that the SCLC, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was out of touch with younger African Americans who wanted the movement to make faster progress. Baker encouraged those who formed SNCC to look beyond integration to border social change, to view Dr. King's principles of nonviolence more as a political tactic than a way of life. The new group played a large part in the Freedom Riders and the Freedom Rides aims to aimed at desegregating buses in the marches organized by Dr. King in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So that is just a little overview in terms of how the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was formed. As far as the Freedom Riders, they were a group of both white and African American civil rights activists who participated in Freedom Rides, which are bus trips through the South in 1961 to protest segregated bus terminals. The groups were confronted by arresting officers as well as horrific violence from white protesters along their routes. They were arrested, they were beaten, and this caused international attention and drew hundreds of new riders to join the cause. The rides continued over several months in the fall of 1961. Under pressure from the Kennedy administration, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued regulations prohibiting segregation in interstate transit terminals. So like I mentioned, college students led and made change. And I will make that statement again. College students are leading and making change. So now I want to introduce you to our panelists.
Absolutely, man. So they deserve a red carpet, honestly, because they're the reason why everybody's here. They're the reason why we're here today, and along with the fact that we're here to celebrate Dr. King. But hey, man, I'm gonna get into it. Let's get into it. So we have Mr. A. Benjamin Spencer. A. Benjamin Spencer, a nationally recognized scholar of civil procedure and federal jurisdiction, became dean of William Mary Law School on July 1st, 2020. He is William Mary's first Black dean of any school at the university. Dean Spencer is the author of multiple volumes of the renowned Wright and Miller Federal Practice of Procedure Treatise, in addition to numerous articles published in journals, including the Michigan Law Review and University of Chicago Law Review. He is one of the nation's most cited civil procedure scholars with the widely used Civil Procedure Casebook, as well as a member of the U.S. Army Reserve Judge Advocate General's Corps, serving in its Government Appellate Division as a captain. In 2017, U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts appointed him to the U.S. Judicial Conference Advisory Committee on Civil Rules. One of Dean Spencer's first acts in his new position was unveiling Why Can't We? An agenda for equity and justice. This 12-point plan of action includes, among other initiatives, creation of a university-wide center for racial and social justice, establishing a community law clinic, and providing need-based scholarships. So we're going to welcome Dean Spencer to the floor, as well as Mr. Professor Sasser. Now, Jackson Sasser, he is a visiting government professor at William & Mary who has been teaching here for 11 years, who has taught, among other things, civil rights, civil rights, civil procedure, and judicial review as well. So those are our first two panelists, and I'm going to let Shanae introduce the other two.
Yes. So I would like to introduce Justin, who is an alum of the college, class of 2009. As State Director of Community Initiatives at Virginia Humanities, Justin helps fund and promote cultural education and preservation partnerships across the state and manages the General Assembly's African American Cultural Resource Task Force. He previously worked at the Morton Museum and National Historic Landmark in his hometown, Farmville, Virginia, and oversees the 2013 opening of the Morton National Award-winning 6 million permanent exhibit on civil rights era student activism. Justin was a student co-founder of the William & Mary Lemon Project on Race, Public History and Memory. and a campus chapter member of the Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. He currently serves on the boards of the Center for Nonprofit Excellence and the Virginia Tourism Corporation. I'd like to also introduce you to Felicia Hayes. Felicia Hayes is a senior here at the college. Felicia Hayes is committed to creating inclusive communities that promote safe and effective learning environments. On May 30th, 2020, Felicia began her activism efforts by protesting the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the many other disparities rooted in racism in her community in America. These protests at Confucius Corner grew weekly from 5 to as many as 175 participants and continued for 26 consecutive weeks. This student-led effort protested police brutality and advanced initiative petitions to seek change for people of color on campus. Her goal for protesting was to educate the people about racism, police brutality, and pressing related issues, hold a space for students and community members to speak on their experiences, and hold the William & Mary community accountable for providing safe space for Black lives do matter. Currently, Felicia is in her final undergraduate semester at the College of William & Mary, seeking a Bachelor's of Science in Kinesiology and Health Sciences with a concentration in public health. She is a 4-year varsity student athlete on William & Mary's track and field team. Felicia strongly believes in bridging the classroom to the community and the individual's responsibility to be a lifelong learner to create the best version of their community. Through her efforts, though her efforts are in the early stages of her life, Felicia has made it a point to devote herself in her future efforts to promote early childhood education, resource development, and inclusive spaces where Black lives truly matter. Welcome to our panelists.
Absolutely. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, and thank you guys for being here. All right. Sinead, did you want to get started with the first question?
Yes, let's see the people. So let's bring down this wonderful PowerPoint, but let's see the people.
Gotcha.
Okay, so let's get it started. I'll just mention that throughout the questions, we'll talk about the history of student activism, the role of the student and community activists, as well as the legal rights of student and community activists. So my first question is, in Dr. King's letter to Birmingham Hill Jail, Dr. King praises the yearning spirits of college students from their nonviolent demonstrations. That said, what role have young people played in activist movements?
Well, I'll kick it off. I think you laid it out well in the PowerPoint, where you really had some great images, powerful images of the young people doing the freedom rides. You mentioned the sit-ins, Greensboro. It was really young people leading the way in many respects. College educated and college age students, they had that energy and that youth. That's where, and John Lewis came up through SNCC, and so I think they had a big role in, some people call it agitating. There's good, John Lewis called it good trouble. It was agitating for a good cause. So they had that direct role you showed in the images, but also I think it was some pushing of like you mentioned, of Dr. King, pushing him in certain directions to make sure that all of the voices in the movement were heard. Um, there may be some of a role as well as where there's, I don't want to call it a good cop, bad cop, but from the public officials' perspective, you have, a lot of agitation that comes in the streets that then gives Dr. King more leverage when he's trying to negotiate with President Johnson. And so there's a role that the people in the streets have for the folks who are trying to, get accommodations, inside the White House or in the halls of Congress. So it's a pivotal role that they play. Wouldn't have had the progress without them.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say, if we're talking about I guess the classical period or the modern period, civil rights movement, and we're looking at the 50s and 60s, and you're looking at young people, then we're really looking at a movement that began with young people. King's entry into the movement is actually relatively late, given, we say 1950, 1951, when Brown v. Board is beginning as a youth-led grassroots movement. And so if you're looking at the 50s and 51, these are young people in 5 cases all across the country who are demanding an equal education, demanding equal resources, and ultimately requesting integration. And I think it's always important to remember Virginia played a significant role in starting what we consider to be the civil rights movement in this country. When we talk about Brown v. Board, we have to remember the Moton 1951 student strike in Farmville, Virginia. We have to remember the fact that this was a 2-week strike organized by a 16-year-old young Black woman. And she was able to corral her classmates and organize a committee to protest the unequal conditions at their Black high school. And these students ultimately went to court and became 75% of the plaintiffs in what we know today as Brown v. Board, which again was 5 cases from across the country. So, if you're looking at 1951, when this strike took place, and you're looking at 1955, where you have Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott and Martin Luther King Jr., young people are at the forefront. They're laying the foundation for what King and many others are able to pick up and continue and add fuel to. And so as we think about the kind of activism, it usually is young people or a young person who's helping to ignite that spark. And the adults in the room are often following their lead and racing to catch up with them. And I think that's definitely the case with Martin Luther King. He had those young people continuously putting pressure on him, actually challenging his thinking and helping his own thinking evolve throughout his life.
Well, I'll just agree with Dean Spencer, Shanae, that I think your setup was just right on. The moment in early 1960 when SNCC is born, I mean, the SCLC is at a real crossroads, having internal debates, almost strategic planning of a kind. Exhaustive thinking was what Ms. Baker called it, about how much and how it would distinguish itself from the NAACP, and how much control local activists should have, and how much voting rights should guide their steps. And it's the sit-in Woolworths in Greensboro on the 1st of February that really solves that question for the SCLC. Reverend Shuttlesworth is preaching in High Point, just circumstantially, it's just around the corner from Greensboro, and he goes and sees what's happening and calls Miss Baker and says, this is it. This is where we're headed, and this is where we need to be. And that really is, one step back of SNCC and the Freedom Rides is those college students calling the tune. So just the highest level of importance imaginable, because that conversation about how to go forward, is really the story of the early 1960s. And it's those 4 college students' decision to walk into Woolworths and sit down that really makes it so.
We're discussing it from a historical stance. but me as a young person, giving my perspective, I feel as if we're the leaders of tomorrow, not to be cliche or anything, but we are the leaders of tomorrow. And whatever action steps that we take can potentially affect what change we see in the world. And I think as young people, we have the responsibility to keep change going, like the ones before us have with, for example, SNCC that we've been talking about, Martin Luther King, many other activists and young people. But I feel that as if that we have the role and the responsibility to keep the change going.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, Felicia, as a student activist, what specific roles or action did you take to sort of become where you are now, as well as Justin, as well as being a community activist currently as well?
So, like Ms. Shanae said to me, or said to all of us before about my protesting efforts, May 30th, George Floyd had been murdered a couple of days prior, and I decided that I needed to get my voice heard in some way. So some of my housemates, a professor passing by, we stood at Confusion Corner, held signs. We just spoke whatever was on our heart. It was a lot of pain, but overall, we had a lot to say and a lot to chant about racism in this country. That continued on for 26 consecutive weeks. We had the goal of just making Williamsburg aware about the issue of racism, and that it wasn't necessarily just about George Floyd or just about Breonna Taylor. Racism isn't always blatant. In fact, it's embedded in our everyday lives. And that was our main goal. One of the things we also did when we protested is we challenged our protesters that came out every week of being anti-racist, of learning more of what role that they played in supporting or dismantling racism.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back over a decade ago now. For me, being at William and Mary as a student activist, which I realized in hindsight maybe I was a student activist. Jackson is shaking his head. So when I was at William Mary, can I call you? I'm gonna call him Jackson, but I guess the students should be calling him Professor Sasser.
You can. Everybody should call me Jackson.
So I think maybe Jackson might have been. You weren't on the receiving end of our student activism, but I think you might have gotten caught up in I guess the crossfire that was happening. When we were students. I mean, we were dealing with a different set of issues. I think, obviously there were many protests. I think that's something that comes with being a college student. I mean, you're in a space, you're with like-minded individuals and friends and people who are challenging you, and you want to make your voice heard. And I think that's something that we always see in college spaces. It's the nature of being young in an intellectual environment that's so rich. I think that the challenge that we were up against, there were many issues, and so at the time that I was at William Mary, we had an Office of Multicultural Affairs, and there were many of us who felt that that was inadequate, and we felt that there needed to be a Center for Student Diversity, and we made sure that our voice was heard. And today we have a Center for Student Diversity. There were students who believed that we needed to really reckon with the history of slavery and racism at William Mary. There were incredible professors who were doing incredible research, and we wanted to support them and make sure that research was better known and supported. And we organized and put pressure on the Board of Visitors and university officials to ensure that the Limit Project would be established. When really, I think kind of the defining moment for me at William & Mary was in 2008, I believe, and when we had our president at the time, Gene Nickel, who obviously there were things happening behind the scenes as the students you don't always become aware of, you're not privy to, but as a 20-year-old kind of looking kind of out, for us, the optics of the situation was that, here we had a president of the university who was attempting to make, significant change faster than many conservative alums wanted. And he was pushed out because of that, particularly when a major donor revoked a $12 million gift because of a decision that the president had made to make campus more welcoming and inclusive. And so we organized and we made sure that the administration and the Board of Visitors knew that the students really supported this president. We believed in his vision for the university. But I think once the decision was made, once he decided to leave or he was forced to resign, we made sure to shift our focus and say, a movement doesn't really hinge on an individual person. There are still goals and objectives that need to be accomplished. And even in his absence, what are the things that we can continue to push for that will continue the work that we believe in? And I think the Lemon Project, the Center for Diversity, those are all things that we continue to push for, as a result of that. So it was a crazy time. 2008, there are a lot of memories that I've repressed, I think, from my own mental health. I left William & Mary feeling very, very drained, very burnt out because of everything that happened. I mean, we had helicopters circling campus because of the demonstrations and protests. The news helicopters were circling around campus during that time. I don't know if this is the right venue, but I do want to say that throughout that period in time, Jackson, you being in the president's office during all of that, you were always a source of support, and I don't think you realize how much that meant to us, because it was a really challenging time for a lot of us. And I think your presence and your calm, your ability to listen to us during that really difficult time, it really mattered, and it meant a lot.
I just want to say thank you, Justin, for your leadership in those days, and your kindness tonight. I hear you on repressing things for one's well-being, but I think what you said about President Nichols' priorities becoming in time the universities is largely true, and I think that is a really interesting context to for us both and for lots of other folks to see those days, and I think you're very wise to say that movements and women and men are not indistinguishable. So I think the work that you did is present all over the place. So thank you again for it.
Thank you. But I will say, despite everything that happened 10 years ago, I am disappointed, honestly, Felicia, because even hearing you talk about the work that you're doing as a student activist currently, you shouldn't have to do that, right? It is unfair, right, for students of color, Black, Native students to come to college and to constantly have to push and not be able to have, this kind of idyllic college experience that we expect, right, when we're graduating high school and we're enthusiastic about finally reaching this milestone. And I hope that William & Mary can get to the point where students like you aren't constantly have to push the institution to live up to its values and what it claims to care about.
I just wanted to jump in and add a couple points. So we've been talking about student activism, and I just want to make the point that there are many different ways to be activists. We might have a traditional vision of literally being in the street, and that's part of it, and pushing from the outside. But I'm reminded, the couple times I've been to the Board of Visitors meetings since I've taken this job, that the current students have very able representation on the Board of Visitors. And the name of the student representative escapes me. I think he's the president of whatever the student government organization is. But every time I've been in a meeting, he is constantly speaking truth to power, and he's in the room, and he's part of the process. That's activism as well. I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. And then also listening to this makes me realize, since I've gotten this job, I've been in a position to do a lot of things basically with the wave of my hand that many people spend years pushing from the outside to see accomplished. And so a lot of energy, or some energy at least, should be put into diversifying the ranks of power and the places and positions of leadership. Because I can tell you, just upon my arrival, there were things that people had been wanting forever to happen. And by the time they got to me to ask, I said, that's already been done. I just did that. I just decided that. That's over. We're on to the next thing. And that also has gone to show me how easy some of these things are. We're asking and fighting and begging for stuff to happen that I can just do. And so it tells me that in the past, or a lot of times, it's a lack of will to do these things. I have the will, so it's easy for me. But a lot of times people in these positions, they just don't have the will, and you have to force them to do it. So, activism is important as long as we're outsiders, but we have to put some energy on becoming insiders, real insiders. Because once we're in that position, it's amazing how much we can do very quickly if we have the will to do it.
Quick shout out, Anthony Joseph, SA president.
That's exactly what I was gonna say.
I've been in meetings with Anthony Joseph. Dean Spencer is absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's not minced word. Dean Spencer, I do want to. First of all, I'm honored to be on this panel with you, because even when I heard the announcement, and exactly it's exactly what you said. To have somebody in your position with the will to make the necessary change. That was just incredible. And it made me feel incredibly proud, for Wade Mary to finally make that decision. So it's an honor. I just want to say to be here with you, and I just want to just agree with everything you said. And I feel like, even when we talk about activism, we do tend to focus on the protest, right? But activism takes many forms, and it exists in many venues. And being at the decision-making table, being at the meeting, being even behind your desk, if you're in an institutional organization and you're pushing for the necessary change, that is a form of activism. And of course, the civil rights movement, the protest was only one component, right? We needed, policy and legislation, but we also needed litigation. And I know Dean Spencer can speak to that history much better than I can, but the events that we saw in the 50s and 60s, that came after decades of groundwork that was put in through the courts and through Howard University Law School, and an incredible team of NAACP attorneys. There was a foundation there. And so the optics and the visuals and the protests that we typically associate with the movement is an important part, but it is one part.
And I'll add to that as I go to the next question, because it's not just being at the table, but bringing others to the table with you. So this question can honestly go for everyone. What inspired you, or continues to inspire you, to let your voice be heard during times when your voice could easily be suppressed? And sometimes, very often it is. People try to suppress it. So what keeps you going?
Just to perhaps bridge this question to the last, I think students like AJ, Mr. President, as some of us call him, he is a leader in the Spencer mold. Last summer, as we were all thinking about how we can best respond, 2 or 3 times my colleagues and I came up with ideas or plans that AJ had literally accomplished through the student assembly. So he has the same will that we've already spoken of, and I think we should just underscore that one more time. As cliche as that sounds, students like AJ and Felicia and Alton, it gets no better.
Well, the question, what keeps me going? I'm impatient, and that's that's supposed to be a negative quality, but and you can see that reflected in the equity and justice agenda that I put together. It's called "Why We Can't Wait." Now, of course, that's a Martin Luther King quote, uh, but it's that urgency that we've been waiting forever, and I mean the notion that we should wait is just absurd. I do a lot of reading about our history, and I'm just so saddened by all of the lost opportunity that is a result of racism in this country. Our people are so great and so capable, and if we were just left alone to do what we can do, we can soar. But year after year throughout the history of this country, you just wouldn't let it happen. And you see time, even that brief period of Reconstruction, we get to soar, then we're smacked back down, and cities and wealth destroyed, and just it's endless. And so, and here we are in 2020, and it's still going on. And so what drives me is, I mean, I'm finally in a position to do some things that should have been done centuries ago. Centuries ago. So with it's, I'm 200, this is an old university, 300 plus years behind. So, I work a lot. A lot of people say I'm a workaholic. I got into work at 6:30 today, this morning, and left at 6:30. I mean, these are 12-hour days. Now that's what lawyers are used to. They're used to 20-hour days. But I work so hard because there's so much work to do. So that's just what drives me is we have, and I've said this, I had to say this to the Board of Visitors, our numbers in terms of Black students are abysmally low. I mean, it's disgraceful. And so I'm personally working to make sure that doesn't happen next year. That takes a lot of time, and it takes, there's a lot that goes into that. The same thing with our faculty numbers are horrendous. It's a disgrace. And I'm working constantly to try to change that immediately, not well over the course of 5 years, we'll be on a path no, it's going to happen next year. That's when it's going to happen. And there's no excuses. People hem and haw, no excuses. We're getting this done now. So that's what motivates me is results, and seeing them and making a difference and making an impact immediately.
I like that a lot, Dean Spencer. I think my inspiration and what keeps me going is rooted in my identity and the lens that I look into the world. So my inspiration, what inspires me, it's rooted in who I am as a Black woman. And I would be remiss if I didn't name off the many names: Martin Luther King, Ella Baker, James Baldwin, Malcolm, Rosa. Besides just thinking away from how we hold them up today, these were just Black people in society, individuals that saw what was set before them and knew it wasn't right, no matter what system tried to convince them that it was, knew it wasn't right, and chose to speak out on that. And I really think that the ones that have come before me are what keeps me going, and knowing how ordinary of a person that they were. They were an individual. They weren't someone at some point in their life that was always held up. But I constantly encourage other individuals, and like I said, other protesters, that it starts with you. And a lot can get done if you see the amount of change that needs to happen and take it upon yourself to make it happen. So that's my answer.
I mean, I guess I can answer. I agree with all the answers that have been said. I mean, also kind of what makes me motivated, like hearing people like Dean Spencer right now, talk about the change that he's implementing, like that gets me motivated. It's music to my ears. To think again, 300 years later, and here we are. It's way past time for some of us, right? But then also, I really agree with what Felicia's saying. You talking about kind of those who've come before us, and kind of the way you reference the ancestors. I think about that a lot as well. Thinking about members of my family, grandparents, great grandparents, and their own everyday activism. I mean, there was work that they did, both in kind of formal organizations, but then there was an everyday activism of getting up and making sure that their families had what they needed, making sure that they, retain, their dignity despite what the world, said, despite what the world told them who they thought they were, right? There's an everyday activism that occurs there. When I think back to my time at William and Mary, I think there was a lot of tension around, how to work together. And I think, one of the things that really kind of kept me going and motivated me, was, I would say, the mentorship of a lot of upperclassmen Black women at William and Mary during the time that I was there. And I think that's critical. I think even if you look back, culturally, we're talking about, the Black community, historically we are a matrilineal society, and there's a certain wisdom that comes from having those strengthened relationships. And I see in hindsight that, it was Black women and Black queer women at my time during William Mary who were investing time and energy in helping my own thinking grow and expand in ways, and so that we were able to build the coalitions necessary as students to make some of the changes that we saw. Somebody just shouted out Dean Carroll Hardy.
Absolutely. And that's really interesting. And I mean, I'm getting fired up sitting in my seat right here, just listening to just listening to just like the amount of greatness in one panel. Given that protests, I want to sort of shift it here. Given that protests are full of well-deserved tension, what piece of advice would you give a student activist regarding their legal rights in these events?
Well, I'll jump in since I'm a lawyer. So this is tricky because everybody knows, you've got First Amendment rights, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, a right to, petition the government for redress of your grievances. All of those things are in the First Amendment. People know a lot about the Second Amendment. You got the right to bear arms, and Fourth Amendment, which really is a center of protection against intrusions on your freedom and liberty without due process. probable cause, etc. So you have all of these rights, but it's the reason I say it's tricky is because the police have a lot of authority and they have a lot of discretion. And so even though people have the right to assemble, police oftentimes have discretion to declare an unlawful assembly, or in some localities, they can declare something to be a riot. And making these declarations, you know, there's warnings that have to come and announcements and opportunities to disperse, and then they have the authority to disperse and detain. And that's not authority, of course, that they use equitably. We know that it's just disparately used. That doesn't mean that they can't do it. And the problem is that the police have a lot of protection. They're debating this, I think, in the General Assembly right now. It's something called qualified immunity. And it's just basically that it's almost impossible to get redress against police officers and the departments that employ them criminally, but even sometimes civilly, because of the wide range of discretion that they have and the ways that the laws are written to allow crowd control. I mean, even things just like, I remember when I was in a freshman, I went to Morehouse College, and I was a freshman, and we were outside of a party. I looked behind me, I saw one of my people who lived in my dorm getting arrested by the police. And I asked the police, why were they arresting him? And they said he was blocking the public way. And they charged him with disorderly conduct. And I had to go, I went down to the jail and ended up getting him out of the jail after, you know, being there overnight. And blocking the public way, I mean, that was that's a charge. And so you can see with those types of, you know, public disorderly conduct things, a lot of those things are kind of the remnant of slavery and, you know, then and Jim Crow, where you replaced it with kind of a police state criminal justice system that easily can label African Americans with, you know, criminal sanctions and then imprisonment. And so some of that still goes on today. So to answer your question, people really need to be really careful because we have rights, but apparently we don't have the same rights that the people who stormed the Capitol have. Because, you know, there's just absolutely no way that any Black person that's ever existed could do any piece of what was done on January 6th. I can't imagine that. So I was reading today that in Florida, they're considering a law that would allow them to declare something a riot if it's over 9 people assembling, and then they could, the criminal penalty would be up to 15 years in prison. This is something that the governor of Florida is supporting. I mean, this stuff is crazy. So you on this one hand, you can say, well, we have all of these rights, and you can go out there and exercise them, but it's do it at your own risk in some instances because we've seen what the police can do, and there's not going to be much recourse on the back end. And I don't know where that leaves things. That doesn't mean don't do it, don't take the risk, but that's the risk that they were taking in the 60s, and people are taking those risks today. I wish we had a stronger set of rights, and that's something the General Assembly is working on. I mean, the qualified immunity thing would be helpful, and there's other things that could be done. People talk about civilian oversight of police departments. So there's different reforms that can be put into place to try to hold police officers accountable, but work needs to be done to provide some more protection.
I definitely agree with the at your own risk and with what's been said before about my activism efforts. It's definitely been done at that. Coming from a different spectrum, I don't know much about legal rights, and but I just wanted to speak to anyone out there that wanted to be the type of like activist that that some of us did this summer and continuing into the first semester. But one of the main things that we considered was preparation. And preparation is very important for us. Like I said, I'm just an ordinary college student, like a majority of students. And we knew things about freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, like you stated before. But every day we went out there, it was about us being on our P's and Q's, preventing anyone from deciding what we were doing was quote unquote right or wrong. And a lot of the times it took research outside of coming out there every Saturday, especially with COVID. We had to stay on top of COVID regulations. So like, for example, they changed a 10-person rule so that we wouldn't really get in trouble for assembling in large groups. We had to put X's on the ground and required each protester to stand on an X to separate each other for COVID restrictions. But there's so much to know. I know you know a lot, Dean Spencer, but coming from a perspective of someone that doesn't know a lot about legal rights, prepare before you go out there, and make it very clear what you are doing when you go out there. Because whether it's people passing by or that claim that they're for you, or people passing by that say they are not for you, or people, or just police officers, what we were talking about before. Preparation is a big part of student activism, or just activism in general, protesting.
Yeah, I just want to echo everything that was said, and you just made me think of something. So in my hometown, one of my, I guess, like surrogate grandfather figures, Reverend J. Samuel Williams, he was a student protester in 1951 at Moton High School, and he later in his life attended Shaw University for undergrad and grad school, and he was part of he was one of the delegates during the founding of SNCC. And I remember he gave a talk, and I think somebody asked, how did you all do what you did, before cell phones, social media, being able to send DMs, do whatever. How did you organize yourselves in that way? And he just simply said, we planned ahead. Like, and getting back to the point of, knowing your rights, but also, preparing ahead of time, mapping out to different scenarios. He said, we planned ahead, if we said that we were going to call you at 3 o'clock, and if you didn't pick up, you're going to miss your ride. Like that was the scenario in those situations. If you didn't pick up the phone at 3 o'clock, you were going to miss your ride to get to point B. They really had to think through and kind of hold each other to, to a certain level of understanding that, our lives in some cases are on the line. And so we can't let one another down in these situations. We have to really think through these scenarios and have a plan in place.
I'm just going to bounce off of that. I'm going to talk about something that we used to do during our protests also. I assigned group leaders for every 10 people that were out there. These group leaders would make sure all protesters were, like I said, on their P's and Q's. There's just so many different ways that you can plan ahead. And I just really wanted to emphasize that. If law enforcement needed to speak to someone that wasn't me, they're talking to the group leaders, it was just a lot of overthinking in order to make sure that we were doing things in a orderly manner and doing things to promote safety of our protesters. So I just wanted to bounce off that. It's a good point, Justin.
Yeah, the planning, Felicia, that you and Justin are talking about, it occurs to me that planning to exercise one's right to vote is just as important these days when states continue to make it harder to exercise the franchise. And Virginia's General Assembly in the last couple of terms is a study in how important that is. I think the limitations on qualified immunity are perhaps dead for this term if the headlines are correct. But in the spirit of things happening long after their time, it does seem that the General Assembly has all but ended the death penalty just this afternoon. And so something that's inextricably bound up with Jim Crow and the practice of lynching, for Virginia to become the first Southern state to get out of the death penalty business. The state that has executed, more than any other, that started the practice in the colonies in 1608. That's not nothing, and it wouldn't have happened without folks planning with the same care to vote as they have in the ways that y'all have discussed.
Thank you for that. At this time, we have come to the end for our formal questions, but as I am inviting our audience to add questions to the Q&A feature, I would like our panelists, if you choose, to give any final thoughts that may have come to mind as we, gone through the questions, or anything you want to leave us with as the questions are coming in. So.
I'll start it off. I said to my wife the other day, after January 6th, one of my new mantras is "time's up," with meaning I'm just done. I'm done. It's a new era, and I'm not having it anymore. I'm just through, because that was just too much. And so we're going to be going forward strong with no apologies. And so time's up, and it's time to make it happen. So that's what I'm about.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. No apologies. I feel as if Black people in America have put up with racism enough. And I also feel as if this country has made it very apparent as into who succeeds. Not even in regards to, I know we're talking about racism today, but the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and people in every aspect of life, people are suffering. Americans are suffering. And I emphasize this all the time, but it starts with you. And if you can look within yourself and decide that you're sick and tired, regardless of whether or not you're Black or not. If you decide that you are tired enough to commit to change, then that's when change will happen. But that we're in the same headspace, Dean Spencer.
All right, if our panelists don't have any final thoughts, then I will ask the questions from the Q&A session. And we have a question for Felicia. And it says, I'm thinking about how over the course of the 26 weeks of protests you and your friends organized, many protesters stood up and spoke powerfully to make their voices heard about the ongoing suffering linked to racism. But I want to ask you about the first protest you organized and about the decision you made to leave Confusion Corner by yourself in order to address the crowd of entirely white people eating lunch at the tables near the cheese shop. You brought a woman to tears that day. Can you just talk about what was going through your mind and how it felt to make yourself vulnerable in that way?
Something I've learned along the way with activism is if you get tired enough, you put aside your own feelings in order to push forth the change that you want to see. So I felt drained after seeing days of George Floyd on the news, on Twitter, everywhere. And what was going through my mind that first day and days to come after that is like I didn't have time to be tired, because from a perspective of a Black individual, for me to be tired would mean me succumbing to the death sentence that this country has given to all Black people. So I went out there outside of Cheese Shop and I spoke from my heart. And I spoke on racism in many areas in this country: education, housing, legislation, just government, everything. I'm in public health, but social determinants, racism is embedded in that. And these were just things that just flow through me. And I was just tired. And that's what was going through my mind. And I spoke on, regardless of what type of feedback I got. So.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. And let's see. I have one more question for Felicia as well. Felicia, who inspires you?
Felicia, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I think I stated before, like the people in the past that have led efforts definitely inspire me to continue on. Just like I said, like they're just ordinary college students like I was. And if they can make a difference, so can I. So.
Can we just strike the phrase ordinary college student from the minutes, please, Felicia? I object to that in the strongest possible terms. It's just a small point of order for you there.
Thank you, because the first time she said it, I had a little twitch. I'm like, ooh, that just doesn't sit right with me, but thank you for saying it. So I have another question. Archie Lord once said, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." Do you believe this statement to be true? If so, are there new forms of protest and activism necessary to dismantle the master's house?
I'm coming at this from the perspective of the law, and there's a lot of truth to that. So you have to learn the law, and people mentioned, the lawyers that came out of Howard University and Charles Hamilton Houston, who led them, Thurgood Marshall and Spotswood Robinson and Oliver Hill, others. And they used the law to achieve a great deal within the confines of the system. But there's only so much the system is going to accommodate. The way that the system was designed in a lot of respects, from the constitutional perspective, it really bakes in a lot of disadvantage and minority rule, if you will. You can see it today with the Senate. I mean, even when the Senate was controlled by Republicans, I think they said that 70 of the senators represented 30% of the U.S. population. because of the way that the Senate is designed. The Senate's a counter-majoritarian institution. And then you have gerrymandering on the House side and the Electoral College, where you can have presidents elected against majority will. And those are things that can't be changed, because I mean, changing the Constitution is almost impossible. So even though you use the tools of the law to affect change, it's really hard to get that done. Even when the vast majority, as you see in this recent election, has expressed its will, the system is such that it still becomes difficult for the majority to make change and to make things happen. So I don't know the answer to that. It is hard to change, as it's called, the master's house with the master's tools. It seems like there's only so far things can go. But that said, I don't want it to be despairing. To the extent that we vote, we saw that in this past election. We see our power. We just get out there and do it. There are even more people who didn't vote. You can still vote. So we can still make a difference. And to some extent, there can still be some victories where you do some fundamental change. I think the General Assembly in Virginia switching party control in recent years has resulted in a lot of changes. They changed a lot of the rules about voting that allowed more early voting and greater access to the ballot, and that resulted in a lot of change. So I guess it's a mixed message that yes, it's hard to get fundamental change inside of the system because it is built in a certain way to be resistant to that. But there are still things that can be done, and we've seen some of that.
I think one of the lessons of the movement is that action on all fronts is really what's needed. And Shanae, back to the introduction that you gave us, you know, the freedom rides are testing a decision issued by the Supreme Court that flowed from act of civil disobedience by Bruce Boynton in the Richmond bus station, you know, and he's all of 21 to the theme of the evening. And so all those things in conjunction, right, are required to get us the freedom rides. I think we should probably say in the moment that we're in at William and Mary that renaming the Master's House is a challenge all its own.
All right, I appreciate all of those answers. Very thought-provoking. To Mr. Justin Reed, can you talk about what you have learned about yourself as an activist, as a leader, and as a person in your time at William and Mary, and just as importantly, rather, since leaving William and Mary?
What did I learn about myself as an activist at William and Mary? I mean, I think I mentioned this earlier too. You know, I left William and Mary very, very burnt out and drained, and it took me some time. I feel like to really come around to even wanting to engage William and Mary again. Honestly, you know, there were just exceptional people there. You know, mentors and faculty members that were still there that kept me connected. And had they not been there, if they weren't still there, you know, I think I would have a very different relationship with the institution. But I'm grateful for them. I think they got me through some really difficult moments. And I think what I learned from my experience is the importance of balance, the importance of self-care, the importance of seeking help when you need it. It's something that I learned. I think, you know, a decade ago when I was at William Mary, you know, we weren't having the same conversations about mental health. I think I know there was definitely much more stigma associated, particularly, you know, for me coming from a rural Black community. You know, I remember mentioning one time to my parents that I was thinking about going to a counselor, and they were like, "Wait, like what? like what are you talking about? Like that's white people. Like that's what they do. We don't do that." And I think the conversation, fortunately, has shifted, and I think that's critical because I think, unfortunately, you know, Black students in particular, but I think, you know, many students of color, you know, face a unique set of challenges when they come into spaces like William and Mary. it wasn't designed for us. It wasn't designed to support necessarily the way we think, and the cultural norms that many of us cherish. It's been structured in a way to support. We talk about the founders of this country. It was structured to support wealthy white men, and so anything that kind of strays from that, there's going to be a rub. It's going to be some tension there when it comes to gaining access to those resources or being supported in the way you need to be. So, I think that's also something that I had to also learn. I think maybe even since my time at William Mary, that William Mary wasn't necessarily structured for me, and I spent a lot of time trying to push it so that it would be. And I shouldn't have had to exert that energy, whether it be in the classroom or whether it be advocating for things outside of the classroom. There was a considerable amount of energy that I was exerting just to create space that I felt would feel comfortable for me, and that shouldn't be my job. And I think I learned this at William Mary, but it rings even truer now. We have to accept the fact that we don't have to accept the fact, but I think we have to understand the fact that kind of higher ed in this country, as it's currently set up, is a capitalist enterprise. There's a bottom line. You have to earn a certain amount of revenue, right? To produce a certain outcome. And I think there are incredible values and ideals that we can hold up and cherish, but ultimately things have to make sense, right? And when somebody who has a considerable amount of wealth disagrees with something that an institution is doing, they have the power to shape that institution. And so I think that's just not a William Mary problem. I think that's just how higher ed in this country is set up. I mean, it doesn't have to be this way if we look at other countries. We don't have to spend as much as we spend on tuition, if we were to rethink how we fund higher ed in the United States. And I think I started to get that message as an undergrad, and I think I have a much better sense of it now. And that's something that, you can't necessarily use the master tools, right? We're really gonna have to think outside the box and reimagine what a higher ed system in this country looks like. And I was on campus actually not too long ago, and I used to give tours when I was there, and I was trying to remember what I used to tell students. I was embarrassed thinking about some of the things I would say on tours when I was a tour guide in hindsight. And despite even some of the criticisms I had, my friend who was with me asked, would you send your children here? And I said, I probably would. Despite everything, right? Would I send my children to William Mary? I think I still would, because, there is something special, right? We're not at UVA, we're not at Tech. There's a different type of community at William Mary that is special, and that is something that I truly cherish. And I think had I been at another institution, I would have simply fallen through the cracks.
Can I just piggyback a little on a couple things? One, the business of higher education has become much more so a business on the public school side, because the government and the state legislatures all around the country, but in Virginia as well, have steadily decreased funding for public institutions of higher education, and which requires them to become more dependent on tuition and alumni giving. And then they're more beholden to alumni, and it's less affordable for students. And so we need to push legislators to increase funding for public schools if they're really going to be a public good that's accessible for everyone. And then you're also right about giving too much power and voice to alumni that are, the ones that are giving all of the money. And one of the things that I saw when I came in, I said, all right, well, we have these alumni who are giving, and it's a minority of people who are giving the majority of the money, but that shouldn't give them the majority of the voice in what's going on in the school. What about the silent majority? Why aren't they giving? Well, they might be disaffected or they're disengaged for some, we need to bring them back into the fold and give them a voice that they shouldn't have to purchase, but that they earn by being alumni of this institution. And then if we start speaking to those people, then maybe they'll start giving as well. And you won't have a alumni giving rate, that's not, in the teens or in the 20s or whatever the rate might be. So, I focus on, well, who are the people who aren't giving? Let's speak to them. And so we can broaden the base of support and not give, too much power to just one alum to be able to pull money whenever you do something that person doesn't like.
Yeah, y'all are definitely speaking a lot of truth to power. I have another question that says, can the panelists speak to the impact faculty and staff can have on-campus activism initiatives where we can help? Also, to Dean Spencer, can you speak to the rights of employees?
I don't have much to say about the rights of employees. I'm new to leadership. And so I know there are different rules for public employees and state employees that I'm becoming familiar with. So I don't have as much to say. I wish I did about the rights and protections for state employees. They should be similar to what the rights are generally in terms of the right to speak your mind and not to have be retaliated against for voicing your opinion. And so those, generally speaking, should be the rights. But beyond that, I'd hesitate to give any real legal advice. I forgot the rest of the question, sorry.
I think I forgot the rest of the question too, but I
think it was how can faculty
Get involved.
support activism?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, for my part, what I hope we're doing, I may not be the person to answer this as a member of the faculty, but Justin used the phrase earlier, what the university claims to care about. And I think closing the distance between that and what we center on our syllabi and how we lead our class discussions and how we're aware of the space that we take up and how we try to make space for voices in the discussion that too long we haven't worked to hear. I hope that those, first of all, I think Justin's exactly right, that we make claims to care about things that aren't borne out by how we carry ourselves. And so collapsing that distance and trying to, I hope, encourage students in ways small and large is a part of the process. But again, I'm probably not the person to speak to that.
So what I'll say is, faculty, I think, should be open to including some of these perspectives and issues in their courses across the spectrum. It's not just courses about history or government, but all throughout. And then do things to work with students outside of the class that provide them support. Make efforts inside of the faculty, whether it's faculty meetings or faculty assembly or whatever it is, to try to push for change and change policies that students may be asking to be changed. Administrators have a role, and it's one thing to encourage faculty to do these things. It's another if you're an administrator who evaluates them. And I evaluate my faculty annually, and I get to determine things like their compensation and annual reviews. And so one of the things that I do is I ask in the annual report, what have you done to further equity and inclusion at the law school? And that's going to be part of your annual evaluation. And so if you start measuring these things and holding people accountable, that can push people to start taking it seriously. Because it's one thing to just talk about it, but you have to put resources behind it, and you have to put your money where your mouth is. So it's incumbent on the administrators to it's easy to give lip service to it, but you really have to say, no, this really matters. It's in the course evaluation. It's in the annual report. And we care about it that much to put it front and center.
One of the questions that came through speaks to similar to what both Dean Spencer and Justin were mentioning in reference to alumni. And the person said, I feel like this school supports a lot of alumni that have negative views on race. What can we do as a student body to respond to this? So what can students do in this situation?
Are we talking about living alumni or dead? Like, are we talking about Thomas Jefferson? Or are we talking about like, who's negative views on race?
Well, it's living alumni too.
Living.
There's a tension. I think they've got to be, brought to campus to have encounters with students. Hopefully, with deans who, I meet with and talk with, not meet you through Zoom, but talk with alums. And we can't shy away from raising these things with alums from across the spectrum and throughout the generations. It's not just one message for one group and another message for another. So when I put out my, Why We Can't Wait plan, I didn't just send that to the alums of the last 10 years. I mean, that went to everybody. And it's something that I discuss with everybody. So I think bringing them into the 21st century, some of them who might need to be brought in that, it's not all of them. The leadership needs to do that, but students can invite them to campus. There may be some alums who have had problematic relationships with some of these issues in the past. Don't necessarily cancel them, maybe engage with them, bring them in and say, okay, we're going to sit down and you'll be on a panel, you can, and we'll have some other folks and we'll talk it out. Or it doesn't have to be a panel, it might be a private discussion. But I think these people can be engaged, and more people are coming around to understanding the change that needs to happen. And students can be a part of that. So, if students are protesting about these things, I think alums will listen as long as the leadership and other alums are trying to bring them along. So they can be moved in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think in some cases, student activism gives certain faculty and administrators cover to do what they really want to do, but may be afraid to do. So if there is that external pressure, or if there is that groundswell of support among students, sometimes that can overpower maybe one alum dissenting voice, or be able to use as leverage perhaps to convince a particular powerful alum or wealthy alum to do what many of us I think on this call consider to be the right thing. It still comes back kind of to this kind of capitalist higher ed model that relies on this kind of pay for play, like alumni giving. I guess it was you, Dean Spencer, you talked about, there are alums who aren't given because of maybe negative experiences that they may have had as a student, or may not feel as if the university is aligned with their values. I feel like there are probably much more of them out there, right? And why not work, as you said, to engage them? And I feel some of that is happening. There are some important conversations happening around engaging alums who have said that they're still healing from their experience at William & Mary, like very frankly said that. And you see the change happening now because the institution is reaching out to them. let's create platforms for those alums.
Yeah, that reminds me of something else that the students can do, and they have done so. A couple things at the law school, students had put together this document called Untold Stories, and these are all these untold stories of adverse experiences that people had based on race or gender, sexual orientation, or religion, and they compiled them in this document that they circulated, and that gave me something that I could use with alumni to say, this is the experience, you know, you may look back fondly, but here's what these people are experiencing at the law school. No one can say that's acceptable. And then there's something similar that I think is on Instagram. I think it's called Dear W&M or something like that, if I'm getting that right. And it'll just, you know, post these just different, again, experiences that are pretty terrible usually. And I use that, I amplify those things. So, you know, students can communicate these perspectives, and then people in my position can share them with the alums. So it's really good work that these folks are doing. And one thing, I don't know if this has been done, I wish it would be done, but if we want these things to be renamed and changed, a lot more people need to, I think, if in written form, maybe, just talk about how it feels. Like, this is how I feel when I have to walk into this building, or this is how I feel when I have to see this statue. And if you just had voice after voice saying those things, there might be more of a groundswell to say, we've got to change it, because we've got all these people who, and I've said it to people all the way at the top. I said, you know, the only thing I can think of every time I have to go into my own building is about these two slave owners that are dancing in front of the law school. You know, but that's outside of my jurisdiction. I can't do anything about that. That's naming and renaming, you know, commission. But, you know, people may think founding fathers. That's not what I think. Someone said once, if you know, if somebody kidnapped your children and sold them away into slavery or and owned them, tell me where you would want me to put up the statue of that person. That's what's going on here. You know, it's one thing to remember folks, but to revere and hold them up as exemplars, that's a different thing. So I think more students need to, and not that this isn't being done, I'm new here, so maybe this is already being done, but really keep up the pressure on trying to get some things renamed and some things taken down or relocated.
Dean Spencer, I definitely agree. Coming to you from a very personal perspective, I have given my perspective of how traumatic it can be of walking past someone who could have owned you. Time and time again, I know many other students have done that. And here we are on a panel still having that very same conversation. The fact that the conversation is being had now after the death of George Floyd, and not 50 years ago, and not 10 years ago, and not 2 years ago, makes me very weary of, or just concerned of performative actions. Like, it's really important that we don't ever get caught up. And it's a perfect time to do it all, but why wasn't it a perfect time 5 years ago? Why wasn't it a perfect time 10 years ago? Yeah, that's just my perspective. I think that William & Mary has a lot to do with letting go. And we hold these men so high, these founding fathers, and just so many other people. And I think a lot of that has to do with, like I said, alumni. I speak about the same things that I was speaking about at Confusion Corner. But I feel as if in order to build an institution and even a country that is inclusive and representative, we have to look at the basis in which it was created. And I think a lot of our issue as an institution and even as a country is we don't know how to let go of these horrible things that just hold us back from growth, of just being an individual and just being a better institution.
And Justin, do you have something to follow up on that?
The only thing I'm thinking about now, Felicia, is, you know, when you said you sometimes feel weary. I do want to applaud the student. I'll say this as an alum. The level of consciousness that you all exhibit today is on a completely different level than what I think, you know, I was over a decade ago, right? You know, many of us at that time, I think, you know, and I think it should be that way, right? As consciousness grows, you know, we begin to kind of critically examine things that we may not have been aware of previously, right? But we recognize now that they're, you know, they can be troubling. You know, they need to be redressed in some way. And so I do want to thank, you know, this current generation of students. We weren't having the same conversation that y'all are having about many of these issues. We were just fighting. I mean, we just wanted more faculty of color. We wanted more students of color. Like, I feel like a lot of our conversations, a lot of our fights was like, you know, admissions, like, can y'all get our numbers up? Can we get a critical mass? Can we get more faculty of color? I feel like a lot of energy went into that. We weren't having the same conversations about, you know, the built environment and, you know, commemorative landscape and how that impacts, you know, students psychologically entering spaces. I mean, that is a different plane, right? And I think it's important to recognize that it may seem like it's been a long fight, but I can tell you 10 years ago, it wasn't even on our radar. So it you know, the amount of change that's happened in my mind has felt extraordinary. So I don't want you to feel weary or as if, you know, change isn't happening, because, you know, as an old alum now, I guess at this point, to me, I guess I'm like grandpa, like, what are y'all kids doing on campus right now? Like, it seems like y'all are, you know, way beyond, you know, where we were.
Absolutely. It's really interesting just how I think tonight it pretty much just emphasized the fact that this is an everlasting and ongoing struggle, and that it's always about the torch. And when you pass that torch, you hopefully that you're passing it going to someone who can do better than you did. And with that being said, we have our last couple of questions for the night. The first one is, how do white parents raise their children to be a part of this work, to raise up the worth of Black and brown lives, and to send their children to college ready to join Felicia at Confusion Corner?
Well, as my students know more than they want, I have 2 children, and we're no models, but CJ and I have tried to think about what the characters in the books they read look like, the stars of the stories that we talk through with them, the friends that we have. There are probably better and more elaborate answers, but I think trying to expose them to the broadest array of leaders we can. That's been our approach.
I think that's good. And, you know, leading by example. You know, sometimes parents who are, they want to raise their kids one way, but then when it comes down to, let's say somebody might be moving in their neighborhood, or there might be a fight over seats in a school or something, where it starts to get really personal, where as they switch from wanting equity and justice to, well, now it's zero sum. You know, something for Black folks is going to mean my kids or I have less. And so I'm all for equity, but not when it's uncomfortable or when it's going to cost me something. That's usually the situation. So even for the most quote unquote well-meaning people. So, and then their kids are going to grow up recognizing that well, it only goes so far. It's fine to talk about. It's fine when it's on the other side of town, but I see how my mom and the dad act when it gets close to home. So it's going to be difficult, but I think that's what we'd have to expect parents to do is live, walk the walk, and don't just talk about it. You have to really be about it when it's uncomfortable. And I think that's one of the things that boils down to is for a lot of folks, it's zero sum. And where, well, if we're able to rise, then they're gonna lose. If there's more of us who are admitted to William and Mary, there's less of them. If there's more of us who have faculty positions, then they have fewer. And so that's the challenge is in raising anti-racist folks. You really have to live it, and that's hard. That's hard sometimes, and I haven't seen a lot of that courage in practice.
I have 2 points. Very, very simple points in regards to this question. Tell your kids the truth. We talk about racism. It doesn't have to be blatant. It's an education. And what I want to do is be an elementary school teacher to tell that truth, be a part of the education system and helping students from being just having that truth stolen from them and not even giving an opportunity to learn it. We see that in textbooks. We see that in just celebration of holidays, Thanksgiving, what the history behind that is. And there's so many things in society where it doesn't necessarily have to be that deep of a conversation, which leads into my second point, exposure. Just exposing your children to, in any way that you can, to what's happening in the world. There's many of times we were at Confusion Corner where there was kids coming up, asking their parents what was going on. Group leaders explaining to their, explaining to children as in why we were out there. Exposure is a big piece. I'm at college and we were married. There have been multiple numbers of classmates. I mean, hundreds, thousands of classmates that when I give my experience, it's such a eye opener to them. And it's basic knowledge of what the Black experience is in America. And it's ridiculous because a lot of these individuals have access to knowing, but just choose not to know. So when it comes time for it to be brought into light, like it has in the past since like summer, it's a shock and it should never be that. So I think exposure and tell your kids the truth.
And my point that I'll just add to this list that I agree with, King talked about transform nonconformists. Many others have as well. I think it's important to introduce white children in particular to historical examples of white people standing up, doing the right thing, sacrificing when they didn't have to. There are plenty of examples throughout history. There are plenty of examples of interracial coalitions, advancing this country forward. I think some people will criticize, many of us and say, we're trying to make history PC, or we're trying to remove all white people from history. And no, that's not the case. You choose different white people to celebrate and revere. they exist throughout history. And at the same time that, some of our presidents who are alums, were enslaving people, they had members of their own family who were emancipating enslaved people and granting them land. We don't talk about those individuals. And so I think it's important that, white children have examples of white people throughout history who are working to be, or who have worked to be transformed nonconformists. They didn't simply go with the flow, right? As they say, they didn't simply accept the status quo. They had a certain, morality to them, and they said, this is something that I believe in. And there are examples of that, whether you're in the 18th century, 19th century, wherever. We don't necessarily have to have, the enslavers on pedestals. There are people who were constantly challenging them on that, even when they were alive, yet we don't talk about them at all.
Thank you. So we have reached our final question of the night, and it's a big one, but I'm gonna throw it out there. It's a good one to wrap up with. So the question is, I am worried that we will lose focus on the many problems our community, university, and our country has with systematic racism. What can we do to keep that part of the conversation, and what is the next step? Told you it was a heavy hitter.
Don't stop talking. Don't stop talking about it. I mean, it's just that simple. It comes with, like I said, that step you make into being anti-racist and supporting the very movements that are going on today and continuing that throughout your life. Like, this isn't a college thing. Like, I talk about how I have aspirations of doing it in the field of education. This is lifelong for me. And it just can't be about just you. You have to challenge someone else to make the difference and keep it going.
I think we need to integrate conversations and education about institutional racism into the curriculum. That's something that I think is underway. I know there's an effort that Rio and others are working on with the provost office to try to do that here at William and Mary. And so we need to make sure we're a part of that and supporting what that looks like, so that everyone has some exposure to these concepts. Because there's a lot of people who don't even understand the issue, let alone trying to solve it. So there's just a lot of education. But that's just here at this level. I'm glad Felicia's interested in being a teacher at the other levels, because it needs to be education throughout all of the grades. But that's how we can keep it going. I like what you said about tell the truth. There's so much miseducation and ignorance. And if you could just, that might be a big way, just getting people educated as to the history. They don't even understand basic history and the connections between things. It's easy for people to think, well, this is the condition of Black people because they're inferior. They don't know the history of the things that have been done to keep Black people down again and again and again. So just having that education and that insight and bringing that all the way through the university level, I think will help keep this thing going. And then with student activists always there to keep everybody honest, you gotta keep the pressure up. Got to keep the pressure up. So don't let up, and you got to make people uncomfortable, because then they'll have to keep moving.
I'm much more optimistic about the pressure being kept up, having heard that Justin's children are coming to William and Mary. So I'm gonna try to stay around long enough to meet those fine folks.
I was struggling to unmute on that one. I was like, did I say that? I did say that. Yeah. 18 years, because we are expecting this summer, so we will see what happens. But I agree with what's been said, and I don't see it letting up on college campuses. Many of them, I don't see it letting up at William Mary. With the spirit of activism that's existed, for so long now. We continue to expose students. I mean, I come out of the American Studies and Africana Studies departments, and the text that I was reading, there's going to be some activism on campus. So I think it's important to ensure that we're exposing students to the breadth of knowledge that exists in the world, because if we have that understanding of really international struggles, right, not just in the U.S., that I think that just lights a fire in you to continue to fight and push for more.
All right, I want to say thank you to our panelists. Alton, do you have any final thoughts? Any final sayings before I wrap us up?
Yeah, this ain't, this movement, man, like I said before, I mean, it's not for a singular protest, a singular legislative action, a singular petition. This is ongoing. And as Dr. King stated, without tension, and Frederick Douglass as well, without struggle, there could be no progress. So we have to continue to make our voices heard, and we got to continue to make people uncomfortable, because that's the only way that change will ever happen. So I'm just excited and I'm grateful to be in the presence of so many great people, and I thank everyone for joining.
Absolutely. So thank you to our panel. Thank you to my co-moderator. And on behalf of the Center for Student Diversity, thank you to everyone who attended our 2021 annual Dr. Martin Luther King commemoration. Enjoy your night.
Take care, everyone.